Welcome everybody. A very good morning. Welcome to today's talk. Thank you for joining this second decolonization book talk at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. We are very excited to have with us Professor Lorenz Lüthi, who is joining us from Canada, from McGill University. I'm your host and moderator. My name is Jayita Sarkar. I am an assistant professor here at the Pardee School. And I'm also the director of the Global Decolonization Initiative that is hosting this talk. This event is made possible because of the support of the Pardee School, the Center for the Study of Asia, the African Studies Center, and the Institute for Culture, Religion, and World Affairs. It is also co-sponsored by the Society for Advancing the History of South Asia. This book talk and a few other events that are coming up next week are part of the Decolonization at 60, series on the 60th anniversary of the UN General Assembly Resolution 1514, also called the Decolonization Resolution and formally called the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. And I'm going to post a link about these other events in a bit. A quick announcement to all of you, that is this talk is being recorded. And so if you do not wish to be recorded, please mute your audio and your video. This also applies to the Q&A, when I'll be asking those of you who have questions to raise hands. If you don't want to be recorded, just write your questions in the chat to everyone so all of us can see it, and we will try our best to get to your questions as time permits. Okay, so let me begin by introductions. As I said, we have a terrific panel with us today to discuss Professor Lorenz Lüthi's recent masterpiece, Cold Wars, Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. It was published earlier this year with Cambridge University Press. I was just telling Professor Lüthi that we first met in Lausanne in Switzerland several years ago when I was a graduate student in Geneva. And it was a star-studded conference on non-alignment and neutrality in the Cold War. And I was an anxious graduate student from Geneva. I took the train up north. And I was in awe of all the speakers, including our author today. So let me say, Lorenz, it's an honor to host you today for your book. Professor Lorenz Lüthi is an associate professor at McGill University. He's a leading historian of the Cold War. His first book, The Sino-Soviet Split, was published by Princeton University Press and won the 2008 Furnace Award and 2010 Marshall Shulman Book Prize. His publications on the Vietnam War, the Asian African internationalism, and non-alignment have broken new ground in Cold War history. Next is our very own Professor Igor Lukes. He's my dear colleague. He's a professor of international relations and history at Boston University. His long list of publications deals with the interwar period, the Cold War, and contemporary developments in East Central Europe and Russia. Professor Lukes has extensively published, and he has many books and has held many fellowships. Notably, he has been a Campbell and Bitton National Fellow at the Hoover Institution, a Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and most recently in Vienna at the IWM. Our next panelist joins us from University of Missouri, Professor Victor McFarland. He's an associate professor in the Department of History. His research interests center on energy, the environment, and U.S. relations in the Middle East, with a special focus on Saudi Arabia. And he has just published this excellent book called Oil Powers. If you haven't read it, you are missing out. You don't know what you're missing out. So, get yourself a copy. As for me, most of you know who I am. I teach political and diplomatic history at Boston University's Pardee School. My first book on India's nuclear program and the global Cold War is under contract to be published with Cornell. Broadly defined, my expertise is in 20th century South Asia, history of US foreign relations, nuclear technologies, and I have a newfound interest in connected partitions. This year, I'm an Ernest May Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have a few colleagues joining me from there, which is great. Hi, Calder. I'm really using this year to make some progress on my second book project on US non-proliferation policy and its intersections with the histories of capitalism, empire, and decolonization. So with that, I extend a very warm welcome to our panelists and welcome to all of you who are joining us from various time zones, I imagine. So welcome and thank you. The format is something like this, that each of us will speak for 15 minutes, and this will give us about half an hour for Q&A. So Professor Lüthi will make his introductory remarks, followed by me speaking on South Asia, then Professor McFarland on the Middle East, and then Professor Lukes on Europe. And I would like to assure you that I am not abusing the host or the moderator's privilege by going first, because I'm not speaking first because I can. I'm really following the trajectory that that Lorenz has encouraged us to think about in terms of making sense of the post-1945 world order, or the world after the Second World War, starting with Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, as his book title indicates. So with that, I turn it over to Professor Lüthi. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind and embellished introduction, and for the very generous invitation and the willingness to organize actually this book roundtable. And I thank also the other two panelists, Igor and Victor. And I thank all of you actually participating yet in another actually Zoom talk, which has become, basically our existence by now. I will talk around 10 minutes about the book, particularly about its genesis and its themes. So I wrote the book mostly in response to some of the books I have been reading and studying in the last 30 years, mostly John Gaddis's Strategies of Containment, Vladislav Zubok's Failed Empire, Chen Jian's Mars China, and Arne Westad's Global Cold War. They all significantly contributed to my thinking about the Cold War in conceptual and thematic ways. But I was working at the Canadian University that is removed largely from an American-centric discourse on the Cold War. And I'm teaching students from 6 different continents, and they really ask very, very good questions, and questions outside of the box. Again, I think that's the advantage of being in Canada. As I conducted research for this book, and by choice, not in American or Soviet archives, but in around 2 dozen archives in 4 different continents, I realized what I had suspected for some time, reading just American and Soviet sources. And what I mean with American and Soviet sources are the minutes of the National Security Council in Washington, or the Presidium meeting of the Khrushchev period. And what I realized is, what I had the strong impression from reading these documents, is that the superpowers were mostly reacting to one crisis after another. But if they were only reacting to crisis, well, who was creating this crisis in the first place? Who caused this crisis? That was then the question I had. And this led me to write this book, where I want to shift the focus by choice away from the great powers to the middle and smaller powers, and explore how they influenced structural developments over the course, not only the Cold War, but in fact, over the course of the 20th century. So the book has 4 interrelated goals. As I said, I want to move our focus away from the global or systemic Cold War to the regional or subsystemic Cold Wars. And the plural is important. The idea is here really to think about how small states like Korea, for example, in 1950 influenced the Cold War, and then continue systematically actually through what I call the periphery of the socialist camp, basically Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Levant, and Europe. The second goal was to move away from the Cold War as the reigning paradigm to explain the 20th century or international relations in the 20th century. The 20th century was marked by decolonization and nation-state formation in the first place. Just think about Vietnam, India and Pakistan, much of the Arab Middle East, and Israel. I also want to emphasize that this applies to some European countries. Think about Poland as it emerges after 1945, or the two Germanys. So we need to integrate these narratives of nation-state formation in more than just a perfunctory way. There are numerous sources why there is decolonization and state formation. Of course, these all are reactions to a certain degree to European imperialism and romantic thought about the nation in the 19th century. But in the Middle East, for example, it's also a reaction to the search of identity after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the end of the Caliphate in the 1920s. This explains the conflict between pan-Arabism and pan-Islamism in the Levant to this very day, which of course is accentuated by the Israeli-Arab conflict. All of these developments predate the Cold War. So we need to put them ahead of the Cold War story, which is what I try to do in the book. This is why I start with Asia and then I move clockwise around the socialist periphery to the Middle East and Europe. Now, my third point is that we have to rethink what the superpowers actually were. What's their role and which powers were superpowers? When did they become superpowers in the first place? Were there only two, in fact? So my argument is that in 1945, there were not two superpowers, but there were the big three. They were called the big three. And it's not only that they were called the big three, they were the big three. There was no number 4, no number 5, no number 6, no number 7, and maybe Australia and Canada then popped up in the ranking. It's completely irrelevant in this discussion that the United Kingdom was financially bankrupt or about to withdraw from South Asia. The USSR was economically destroyed. We still make it one of the big three, right? The United Kingdom controlled more territory outside of its homeland and ran a bigger navy than the USSR. Moscow only had more soldiers on the ground. Similarly, we need to throw out the term polarity, as if there are two sort of magnets that sort of draw the whole world into one or the other direction by some invisible hand. And all states, the rest of the world is falling in line. The Cold War was quite regional in the late 1940s. It became only globalized after the Korean War. And what I mean with globalized is not even, including Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. It was globalized at the periphery of the socialist world or of the Soviet Union. It truly became a global phenomenon, I think, by around 1970. But after that, it starts actually to contract again and to withdraw from parts of the world. And it does so in different ways in Asia, in the Middle East, and Europe. And it's exactly because this is how I see the Cold War. I'm not talking about superpowers until the 1960s. This is when the United States and the Soviet Union, on the basis of nuclear weapons, really are able to play in a class of their own. But interestingly, at this very time where they actually become superpowers, they also lose their ability to influence events at the bottom. Keep in mind, the United States had the largest number of nuclear warheads in the early 1970s, and it still lost the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union had the largest number of nuclear missiles in the 1980s, and it still lost the Afghanistan War. Military power at the global level does not necessarily mean political influence at the local level. And fourth and finally, in this book, I'm also interested in spillover effects. How do events in one region, world region, influence events in another world region? The Korean War is really a great example. It's not the only one. This is a very local conflict, but it shaped developments in China, in Indochina, in South Asia, in the Middle East, and in Germany. Another example is the triple crisis in 1956 in Poland, Hungary, and Suez, which had influence across actually that Eurasian continent. And again, events in the late 60s or the year 1979, they all come together and create actually enormous spillover effects in all kinds of directions. So ultimately, the book explores how countless acts by regional and smaller powers collectively, sometimes in parallel, sometimes actually in an interactive way, change the structure of the Cold War at the lower levels. And finally, this leads then to the question is why the Cold War ended so suddenly in 1989, which is the standard explanation. And my answer is, well, it's looking back, it's not really a surprise. The structures for the end of the Cold Wars, of the regional Cold Wars, had already been put in place by the early 1980s. And well, then the question is, why did it take so long for the superpower Cold War to end? Why did it take all of the 1980s for the superpower Cold War to end? So I leave it at that. And I'm very curious about hearing what actually the commentators and the participators think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lorenz, for sharing such a succinct overview of your, most of you have seen it already, of your 756-page book in less than, I think, 10 minutes. It was an utter delight to read your book, and for a book that is so extensively researched, I must say I was struck by how lucid the text is, and it's so easy to follow. So what Lorenz does, in my understanding in this book, is that he successfully strikes the right balance between proximity and depth, as well as distance and breadth, in crafting these entangled histories of the region. So I'm going to divide my comments into three parts, and I'll try as well to be as brief as he was. I'm going to start with what I liked about the book, focusing on South Asia, what it means for understanding the global Cold War in South Asia. Then I'm going to have some brief historiographical remarks, which I'll keep brief because discussing the historiographical contribution in and of itself is a different book. And then I'm going to end with two specific questions, and if time permits, perhaps one broad question. So in Cold Wars, what I really liked is that Lorenz had brought regional histories of the 20th century into direct conversation with what he called structural histories of the Cold War that have been predominantly focused on the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. His is an interconnected set of narratives in which smaller and middle powers have a lot of agency. In his words, South Asia at the dawn of decolonization was like a giant Swiss cheese sticking out into the Indian Ocean. The straight side stood for coastlines, and the holes, the 500 or so princely states, and the polished peel of that cheese was the ill-defined border areas of the north, northwest, and northeast. The above quote, which is quite humorous, but also reflects his clear understanding of the territorial challenges experienced by the nascent nation states that emerged in the region within years of the end of the Second World War in that part of the world. And I also agree with him in chapter 7, where he underlines on India, where he underlines the significance of the 71 war in South Asia and its long-term effects on the nation states, as well as the subnational actors in the borderlands in the region. And I think he makes a really important contribution when he connects the 71 war with the war in Afghanistan, beginning in 1979, a war that in Cold War historiography, we really understand it, we often, not really often, understand it as a proxy war between the superpowers at the end of détente. So Cold Wars, for understanding the global Cold War in South Asia, really couldn't have come at a better time. And I say this for three reasons. First of all, over the past years or so, there has been an increasing interest to understand diplomatic and political histories of the South Asian subcontinent through a transnational lens. And that has led to scholars making calls for approaches towards a global South Asia or a South Asia in the world, very much like US in the world, instead of foreign policy histories of a single country and its bilateral relationship with another. And notable works that come to mind are those by Elizabeth Leake, her book on the Pashtuns, her most recent work on the Afghanistan war, Bernice Richard's work on NEFA, so between China and India on the borderlands between the two countries, Lydia Walker's work on the Nagas, Jessica Namakal's work on French decolonization in the subcontinent, and our own Ben Siegel's work, who will actually join us as a discussant next week for a book talk. His work on food and famine as some of the examples of the scholarship that is really trying to push these boundaries. The second is that writing the histories of the Cold War in the South Asian subcontinent is a relatively new phenomenon. And I remember as a graduate student, when I would discuss my dissertation topic to friends and family in India, they would often raise an eyebrow and respond with the words that, but the Cold War did not happen in India, right? It was happening in Pakistan because they had alliances. I am delighted to report that things are a lot better now, and much has changed since over the past decade. And most notably, this has to do with Srinath Raghavan's path-breaking book, War and Peace, published in 2010, which really inaugurated diplomatic and political histories of South Asia. So Raghavan's work, along with those of Paul McGar's role with the role of the UK in the Cold War, David Engerman's influential book with the economic Cold War in India, and most recently Tanvi Madan's recent work on what she calls the fateful triangle of India, China, and the United States, have really inspired a younger generation of scholars to investigate the Cold War in its own terms and understand the Cold War with its multiple timelines in the subcontinent. Third and finally, for someone teaching at BU, and this is a course that actually my colleague Igor Lukes also teaches when we alternate. As somebody who teaches the histories of international relations after 1945, every semester I see my students' eyes light up when they hear and understand the meaning of the term pericentrism, which I introduced to them through Tony Smith's well-known article in Diplomatic History 20 years back. Right? And he says that it's important to center those on the periphery into the histories, or perceived peripheries, in my opinion, into the histories of the Cold War. And so what I find that Lorenz has done in Cold Wars is really implementing flawlessly this pericentric approach to make sense of the world, of the 20th century world after the Second World War. And I can't wait to use it in the classroom next year when I get back to teaching. Moving on to the second part, just with some brief historiographical remarks, and I will really be very brief, is that Arnie Westad's Global Cold War in 2006 really first called our attention to conflicts outside of superpower rivalry in Europe, and really shaped the field over the last decade or so. And since then, Cold War studies at the LSE and Cold War International History Project at the Woodrow Wilson Center, from which I believe each of us on this panel have benefited in some shape or form, has really encouraged the study of post-1945 world outside of Moscow and outside of Washington. Most recently, Westad has also asked us to challenged our imaginations of timelines as to when it began in his Cold War, A World History book, where he traced the beginnings of the Cold War to the 1890s, which according to US historians is known as this era called the Gilded Age. 2 years back, Paul Chamberlain's book on Cold War's killing fields really produced this excellent account of the bloody wars that has taken place after 1945, making sure that these hot wars cannot be dismissed as mere aberrations or mere proxy wars in the so-called long peace. So what I find in Cold Wars that Lorenz urges us to study the entangled histories of smaller and middle powers, and that these smaller and middle powers have agency, and they have both influence and are influenced by the superpowers, but they also have their own influence on these greater powers. And he calls this in the book, which I really liked, he calls this a colorful tapestry, where there are multiple foci, multiple timelines, multiple alternative ideologies, such as Asian African internationalism, non-alignment, and Eurocommunism, to name a few. And he emphasizes on three levels: the national, the global, and the regional. And this really helps capture the complex histories that have so far been merely in the background for 20th century world, for accounts of 20th century world in the Second World War. So for graduate students, postdocs, and junior faculty such as myself, Lorenz sets a new research agenda because he calls us to integrate a thick description of the local with a clear understanding of the global. And I think it's extremely important. And for those of you who are starting, I don't think there are a lot of junior folks here. I see Florian though. For those of you starting out your academic research careers and wondering how to incorporate, the complex regional histories with the global story of the Cold War, Lorenz Lüthi has already done that for you. So I think we should all thank him for that. I'm going to end with two specific questions, and as I said, if time permits, maybe the broad one too. So Lorenz, my specific question, my first one is about chapter 11, which is Asian African internationalism. And you say that these key actors in Asian African internationalism initially considered their movement as a potential regional substitute to the United Nations. But that changed with formal decolonization and as new states became UN member states. And we also learned by the end of the chapter that formal decolonization paved the way for disunity among these countries, and that's such that by 1965 there was not much left of the Asian African internationalism. So my question is, why do you think that was the case? And I'm just wondering if it had anything to do with the rise of subnational movements within the borders of many of these new nation states, which probably made them a bit nervous about decolonization, because any further decolonization would probably mean encouraging secessionist movements within their own territories or within what they consider to be their own borders. So what did decolonization have to do with Asian African internationalism in terms of UN and also their own disunity? The second question is not related to South Asia, and I apologize. It's the other chapter on nuclear weapons, which, as you can imagine, I couldn't help but focus on and pay very close attention to. So first of all, I want to say this chapter 14 is an excellent overview of all things or most things nuclear, because it covers proliferation, non-proliferation, arms control, arms race, all in 23 pages. It's just amazing how you have accomplished that. So really kudos to you. And I think it'll be a terrific chapter to assign to students to give them a taste of the subject. So my question is really about the word status that you mention a lot actually in that chapter. You do mention status in chapter 7 when you talk about India's first nuclear explosion, but in chapter 14, when you're talking about nuclear weapons acquisition by the United Kingdom, France, China, Israel, you constantly evoke status. So I'd like to ask you if you could explain what status means. Does this mean prestige as the main driver as the main driver of nuclear proliferation in the case of these countries, or is status doing more work in the sense, does status also encapsulate perhaps military and technological capabilities and the resultant status from therein? So if you can unpack status for us, that'd be great. Perhaps I'm just going to quickly ask the broad question, and that is, I see you're asking us to think out of the box, especially those of us trained in Cold War history, and to integrate these multiple levels. And I think that's terrific. But I also find that the focus is really nation states. You're focusing on nation states as the main political unit. But then the 20th century, as you have told us, in the introduction, the first chapter actually, that there were multiple territorial possibilities. I mean, the 20th century was a century of multiple territorial possibilities, where the nation state was far from a foregone conclusion. And the domination of nation-centric histories in our subfield of Cold War is also why we get a lot of criticism from other historians. And so my question is, why did you choose to make nation states as a unit of analysis and not incorporate also the histories of and from the borderlands, so that perhaps we could go towards as a field for a multi-scalar history of the 20th century after the Second World War? But thank you once again, Lorenz. I really enjoyed the book, and I look forward to an enthralling conversation. Thank you.
Can I just ask, how do we proceed now? Shall I direct a reply quickly, or shall I wait for the other commenters?
I think in the interest of time, we could move to all our discussants, and then as I collect questions from the participants, you could start responding to our questions, if that's okay.
Okay, okay, then I will put this on the side here, and okay, great.
Okay, great, wonderful. So I pass it on to Professor McFarland.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jayita, for the invitation to speak and to BU for hosting us. And thank you to Lorenz for giving us such a marvelous, rich book to discuss. There's a lot to learn from this book, even for those of us who've been studying the Cold War or the regional politics discussed in this book, in my case, the Middle East, for years. So I'm really glad we get this chance to talk about it. In the interest of time and following the example of Jayita and Lorenz himself, I'm going to do my best to keep these comments very brief. So let me say at the beginning, I wish this book had been available when I was writing my own book on US-Saudi relations. It would have been very helpful for me in helping me keep in mind the bigger picture and the broader context of international relations in the Middle East during the 20th century. Lorenz does a really marvelous job of juggling a number of complicated stories. This book is a tremendously impressive work of synthesis in the best way, of compression and lucid writing. I can see it being very useful for teaching, but also, as I mentioned, for those of us who study this history, it's tremendously helpful for contextualizing our work and challenging some of our assumptions and some of our conceptual categories. So what's so remarkable about it? It looks at the role of smaller states and middle rank powers and gives them their due in the story of international relations and the Cold War during the mid to late 20th century. It de-emphasizes the superpowers and shows how often they were reacting to events rather than driving events, and goes beyond the Cold War too as a chronological framework, and shows how different the international system was in the region during different periods of time that might all be lumped together during the single era of the Cold War by other authors. So to take the example of the Middle East, Lorenz shows us what a turning point Suez was in 1956, or the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement at the end of the 1970s, producing really quite dramatic shifts in the international system in the Middle East. So Middle East politics looked very different during the 1940s and 1950s compared to the mid 60s through the mid 70s. And so breaking up that single era of the Cold War helps us see different aspects of Middle East politics that we would lose if we just think in terms of 1945 to 1989 or 91. So let me give a brief outline of the argument on the Middle East for those of you who haven't had a chance to read this book yet. And I certainly encourage you to do so the first chance you get. Lorenz argues that at the end of World War II, Middle Eastern politics were not yet dominated by the bipolar US-Soviet struggle, and in fact, arguably they never were, but certainly not immediately after World War II. Britain still exerted considerable influence in the region, and even the Arab League, that classic expression of Arab nationalism, was in part a product of British imperial influence. It was an organization that British leaders hoped could serve their own interests. Although they lost much of their influence over that organization, and in fact, British leadership in the region collapsed with the Suez Crisis in 1956, which opened the way for the US and the Soviet Union to become the most important external actors in the region. Lorenz argues that the Cold War had already started to influence the Middle East, beginning with the Korean War period, but Suez was the critical turning point here. Even with the Suez Crisis, though, the Cold War was not yet the dominant influence on events in the region. The US and the USSR had similar positions on some of the most important issues in Middle East politics. To take two examples, they both recognized Israel soon after that state was founded, but they mostly kept their distance from Israel over the next few years. They also both supported Egypt during the Suez Crisis in 1956. Only with the mid-1960s did the Cold War truly emerge in the Middle East, and Lorenz dates this to 1964. That occurred in part because both sides in the Arab-Israeli conflict, which is a central theme in all the chapters on the Middle East, both sides in the Arab-Israeli conflict sought to take advantage of Cold War dynamics to secure support from the superpowers. Israel was increasingly armed first by France and then by the US, while its most important opponents, Egypt and Syria, were armed by the Soviet Union. Even during that period, though, 1964 to 74, which Lorenz argues is the period when the Cold War in the Middle East was at its height, even during that period, the most important regional actors in the Middle East were trying to maintain their own autonomy and distance from their superpower patrons and trying to escape some of the bounds of the Cold War. Lorenz charts the Palestinians' attempts to establish a Palestinian state and how that both influenced and was influenced by the main interstate conflicts and rivalries in the Middle East. He takes the story up through the 1970s with the emergence of pan-Islamism, or rather, Lorenz emphasizes pan-Islamisms, since this is a very heterogeneous set of political movements. The Saudi and Iranian versions are best known, but he also draws our attention to Islamism in Egypt and Pakistan, coming both in state-led versions and non-state oppositional politics-based Islamism. Lorenz argues that the Cold War in large part ended in the Middle East by the late 1970s with two developments. The Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, which was, despite the US role in negotiating the Camp David Accords, was not primarily a product of either US or Soviet influence in the Middle East. And the rise of Islamist movements to influence, and sometimes, especially in Iran, to state power. So from a certain perspective, the Cold War was already over in the region by circa 1979. But the superpowers didn't realize it yet. And I sometimes had the sense that the US and the Soviet Union were stumbling forward zombie-like after 1979, and they just didn't realize how much the structure of politics in the Middle East had changed. They were aware that pan-Islamism or political Islam had become a powerful force, but they hadn't quite assimilated that into their thinking and didn't know how to respond to it. And so, ironically, the only conflict in the greater Middle East that Lorenz argues was truly a product of the Cold War was the war in Afghanistan, which happens after the Cold War ceases to become the organizing principle of interstate politics in the Middle East. And so the people of Afghanistan are the ones paying the price for the US and the Soviet Union failing to realize just how much the region has changed. So we're left at the end with a rather grim conclusion. The Afghan people, the Palestinian people, and other peoples in the region have paid the price for the superpowers' actions and the way that local actors mobilize superpower support for their own agendas. Some of the political forces left standing in the region at the end of Lorenz's book are Saudi Islamism and Iranian Islamism, both of which have had rather malign effects on many countries in the Middle East. That is the rough outline, and I hope I've done it justice to Lorenz's argument about the Middle East. I have mentioned some of the things that I think are so remarkable about this book and so helpful about it. Let me end with just a few questions now. One is a specific question. How do we fit in some of the earliest crises of the Cold War which occurred in the Middle East, the Iranian and Turkish Straits crises of the late 1940s and the Iranian coup of 1953, which are de-emphasized in Lorenz's narrative and his choice to date the emergence of the Cold War in the Middle East only to the 1950s at the earliest, and not truly until 1964. Do we understand these as basically local events driven by local agendas that appeared to the superpowers to have a Cold War frame? Or how do we understand these? And particularly, I'm wondering about the Iranian coup, which some U.S. policymakers certainly saw as a Cold War crisis and an opportunity for the Soviet Union to increase its influence in the region. Not the Iranian coup, I should say, but the events leading up to it, Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil. A broader question I'd like to ask is, to what extent is the idea of the Cold War or Cold Wars the most useful organizing framework at all for understanding Middle East politics? I think Lorenz has very convincingly shown us that the Cold War was not the main organizing framework for interstate politics in the Middle East. He's emphasized both in the book and in his comments just now the importance of decolonization and state formation. So should we really understand the story of Middle East politics as an attempt to answer the question, what will replace the Ottoman Empire and the European protectorates and mandates? What sort of political order will emerge after 1945? Should we really not be thinking in Cold War terms at all? And then finally, let me ask about the ideological effects of the Cold War. There's some really fascinating hints of the protean nature of Cold War ideology in this book. I think the main example being that the Ayatollah Khomeini, a fierce anti-communist and critic of the Soviet Union, just as much as the United States, borrowed from Marxism, borrowed some of his political ideas and vocabulary, borrowed from leftist influenced and Marxist influenced Iranian opposition figures. The whole idea of building a mass political movement led by a revolutionary vanguard that Khomeini adopted was very heavily influenced by Leninist ideas. And you can find similar examples throughout political Islam in the Middle East, of the adoption of Leninist methods and ideas. Even Khomeini's accusation that the United States was the great Satan comes in part out of Cold War propaganda. And Abbas Amanat has a fascinating passage on this in his book, Apocalyptic Islam and Iranian Shiism. And on the other side, anti-communism and counter-revolutionary ideology was mobilized by other forces in the Middle East, like the Saudi monarchy, the example I know best. In 1951, the Saudi King Abdulaziz told the US general, if you can find a communist in Saudi Arabia, I'll hand you his head. And so there are some indigenous roots to that anti-communism, but a lot of it was also about playing to a US audience. And it wasn't just directed at the United States, though. The Saudi regime and other autocratic regimes in the Middle East used anti-communism to discredit their domestic opposition and to crush, for example, the Saudi labor movement. So even if the Cold War was not the main driving force behind state policies in the Middle East, it influenced the political vocabulary of people in the region. It influenced the ideas of groups, even the Khomeinist revolutionaries in Iran, who were the most adamant about not being tied to either superpower. So I'm wondering how we integrate that into our story, the influence of the Cold War beyond international relations, its influence intellectually and in terms of political ideas and vocabulary in the region. So with that, let me wrap it up and hand it off to our next discussant.
Excellent. We now turn to Professor Lukes on Europe. Thank you. Thank you so much, Victor.
Well, thank you, Lorenz. And I certainly agree with Jayita that you've given us an excellent book, and much needed book, which I see as being based on, in my opinion, the correct premise that most previous books on the Cold War focus on the superpower competition, or indeed on the relations between one of the superpowers and one client state or a regional player. Certainly, we're all well too familiar with images of the Berlin crisis and the Berlin Wall coming up and the Cuban Missile Crisis and unrest in Poznan in '56 and Soviet tanks in Budapest and Prague and John Paul II speaking to crowds in Poland. I certainly have had my share of those images. So I agree that we certainly know much less about the damage the Cold War had done in large parts of the globe, in South Asia, or certainly the Middle East, as we've heard. But let's not forget the Horn of Africa and other parts. So as I see it, the book basically chops up the established concept, the Cold War, into various, I think you used the word subsystemic regional Cold Wars. And then within each region, the superpower thought it dominated, it dictated. But in reality, you argue, the alleged puppets occasionally dominated, or well, dominated is too strong, manipulated or at least influenced the puppet master's options, narrowed the puppet master's options. I can see in your library books on opera. And so I'm not surprised that you say that the book structure evokes Wagner. I would note that the structure probably evokes Wagner, but its argument is summed up in Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, where, as you know, Figaro early on discovers his master's evil plan, and he turns the ploy upside down when he says, "Se vol ballare, signor continuo." If you want to dance, I will play the tune. And I can well see that this could conceivably apply to various moments in Cold War history within the East Bloc, which I focused on in my reading of your book, in the relationship between the East Bloc countries and the puppet master in the Kremlin. So the book doesn't say, of course, you don't say that the United States and the Soviet Union didn't matter, but you give, I really hate using this word, agency to the smaller players. And whether it's China or India and some of the other regional players, as we heard from Victor in the Middle East, that I don't doubt. But I think that even in Eastern Europe, we find some entities. Poland comes to mind, but certainly before Poland, then there was Yugoslavia with the split between Tito and Stalin, and subsequently, of course, Romania becoming the alleged dissident in the bloc, which the West attempted to sort of support, only to discover later on that it supported the wrong player, I think, in the region. It just built up another tyrannical regime. So I completely accept this approach, but I would go further than you. And I would, in fact, argue that the status quo, balance of power, and the whole existence of the Cold War were ultimately overturned, not by either of the two large players, that is Gorbachev's Soviet Union and Washington, but this could be just me, but I believe that the Cold War and the whole status quo was thrown out the window by Poland, by the unexpected, seemingly irrational behavior of the Poles. Acting on its own, I think Poland unexpectedly defeated not only its jailers or its puppet masters in the Kremlin, but it also defeated its putative supporters in the West, who from at least 1988 and through the end of 1989 had done all they could to defend the status quo, that is, to protect the existence of the Cold War pattern of power, while the Poles were saying, no, we're not interested in what you think. We want to go all out. We want free elections. We want multi-party state. And if you keep your president, then we, will get the prime minister. And I think that this is one element that really still needs to be built into our understanding of the Cold War. How, in fact, at the end of the era, we find this incredible paradox where the West is saying, and some of them in fact said it, some politicians said it explicitly, we are comfortable with the Cold War. This is a pattern we understand, and this is something we're not just going to see flying out the open window without more preparation, without more reflection. And therefore, at the end of the Cold War, I see this incredible and really unexpected paradox where even the Soviet Union is an agent of change within Eastern Europe. I'm sure you're familiar with Gorbachev's visit in October 1989 to East Germany, where he says history itself will punish those who postpone change. And on the day of his departure, the East German regime essentially starts surrendering to the masses who come out to demonstrate, right? So it's Gorbachev who is pushing for change, even in Prague. And you note correctly that the Czechs were late comers to the protests. But when they sensed that, in fact, there was no price to be paid for protesting, 1 million people show up in the streets, right? And the West doesn't know what to do about this. Meanwhile, Poland had already its free elections, and the former Solidarity prisoners and conspirators and people who had been driven underground are now senators. And at the urging of George H.W. Bush, the United States ambassador in Warsaw is coaching Solidarity members how to tolerate the election of Jaruzelski as the president of Poland, that is the jailer of Solidarity, how to bring about his re-election as president without actually having to vote for him. They were instructed to walk out at a crucial moment. Yeah? So this was a scheme devised by the United States to maintain Jaruzelski in power, the very man that George H.W. Bush's predecessor, Ronald Reagan, had been denouncing throughout the 1980s. And of course, notoriously, a United States Secretary of State said, Weinberger said that Jaruzelski was a Russian general in Polish uniform, right? And here is the United States plotting to maintain Jaruzelski in power. George W. Bush goes to Poland and says, we're not going to interfere. We're not going to offer opinions. He flies to Budapest. This is 1989. And same theme. People welcome him as the apostole who brings peace and liberty and capitalism and everything, open society. And Bush says, slowly, be careful. Our main objective is to maintain Gorbachev in power in the Kremlin. Everything else is secondary. So I think that this is an important theme that will still need to be somehow built into our understanding of the Cold War. But I want to say that I wholeheartedly embrace your own view that the Cold War had ended earlier than is normally perceived. When you ask anyone when the Cold War ended, some will say it ended when the Berlin Wall was breached in November '89. Others will say it ended around Christmas 1991 when the Soviet Union disintegrated. And of course, that's true if you define the Cold War as a contest between two armed camps. Then certainly it lasted, as I said. But I think a more accurate, more ambitious definition of the Cold War would have to note that it was a contest between two camps, each of which was advancing its own way of organizing ethical, ideological, political, and economic affairs of humanity, right? And if you see it this way, you seem to be saying that it ended either at the end of the 70s or maybe even early 80s. I'd go further and suggest that, in fact, Cold War so defined, it ended in the second half of the 1960s, when the electronic revolution and computers burst onto the scene in the West. Yeah? Suddenly they were not just for putting a man in space or running some sort of gigantic computers in the Pentagon. Suddenly computers become common in issuing bills to telephone customers or gas, or they become part of regular factories. Car makers in Germany have computers. And I could demonstrate, we can talk about it on a separate occasion, in fact, that at that point, the East Bloc is completely lost. And whereas previously in the early 1950s, they were desperate, they couldn't care if the West imposed sanctions. Now in the 1960s, they fear sanctions because they realize they cannot exist without Western technology, without plastic materials, and certainly computers and all the other electronic devices. So since both of my colleagues attempted to not just praise you, but pose questions, I would say that this certainly is an excellent book. But if I really had to say something critical about it, I think I would note that the older I get, the more impatient I become with using these large labels like Soviet Union, France, Great Britain, but also Poland or Polish Church. It's not a homogeneous creature. It's a very diverse entity. And I think that if I miss something in your book, it's people. It's more human beings. But as Jayita noticed, it's well over 700 pages. So I understand that every author has to make choices. So thank you very much for writing this book, and I learned from it, and I really enjoyed reading it. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Igor. We are now going to spend a few minutes with perhaps Lorenz could respond to some of the questions. Please be brief, and in the meantime, I will, we're going to gather questions. So please raise your blue hand, and I'm just going to add this to the chat as to how to raise your blue hand. I don't think you need instructions anymore. We are so many months into our Zoom lives, but just in case. So please raise your blue hands, and I will call on you. And in the meantime, we're going to hear from Lorenz about some of the questions we raised. Lorenz, the floor is yours again.
Well, thank you very much for all the great comments, the praise, and the critical questions. I will be very brief because I can individually talk with you too, and I will go backwards in the order. So I will just respond, to Igor. Thank you for pointing out Le Nozze di Figaro, my favorite opera. So of course it should have been in there. I completely agree with you that the superpowers, and actually, in fact, West Europe tried to, basically, were very comfortable with the Cold War in the 1980s. Particular Helmut Kohl, with the billion credits to East Germany, just as an example. I think Helmut Kohl in the second half of 1989 started to rethink, right? He was pushing this whole thing, but even Gorbachev, on October, when it was shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, basically, I think it was November 13th, sends a message to Kohl, remember there will be always two Germanys, right? So it was just so, in many respects, so unexpected that everything was falling apart. Even for me, I lived through it as a teenager with family in East Germany. My family always talked about how the Cold War would continue eternally. We could not imagine 89. But in retrospect, when you look back, we see actually how everything was falling apart, or on the Soviet side or the socialist side. I completely agree with you. The 1960s are very important. This is where I think, and I should write about this in chapter, I think 16 on the CMA on Comecon. This is where the Soviet Union realizes it faces a problem, right? And then the unreformability of the Soviet system comes in. So let's talk about this maybe one-to-one if you have the chance. But many things, and the idea that the West and the superpowers were comfortable with the Cold War in the 1980s is one I completely agree with, and it sort of doesn't come through in the book, which is probably, my mistake, my error. I should have made this much clearer, that there's this feeling of being comfortable with a divided, at least Europe. So let me just go backwards here. Let's talk, Victor, you, let me quickly, how does Turkey, Iran, 45, 46, and 53 fit into it? Is it local? I think in the case of Turkey, 45, 46 with the Dardanelles, and that is probably not just a local Soviet interest. It is, however, an event that intensifies the conflict between the superpowers. I try to stay away from Iran. My focus was most on the Arabic Levant. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with a lot of the literature on Mossadegh. I think, there's both the criticism on the left and on the right is that sort of this, the argument is that the CIA had all this power and they could run Iranian affairs. You just have to parachute a couple of agents into Iran and then you can pull strings. I'm just very skeptical about these kinds of arguments. I'm also skeptical at Mossadegh. I see him somewhere as a cross between Nero and Nasser. Was a modernizer acting in a very violent and vibrant political system in which actually physical violence was a part of actually political life. And so he's made by many in retrospect because of what the Shah becomes sort of as this lighthouse, as a path not taken. I'm just a little bit skeptical about this, but I'm not a specialist in Iran, and so I decided that this is one of the things I'm a little bit more careful about, and I'm not going to wade into. This is in general one of the issues I had working on the Middle East. I'm not a Middle Eastern specialist. I'm really working as a non-specialist on the Middle East, and I felt often that I'm basically walking on thin ice, particularly in the Islamism chapter, or Pan-Islamism chapter. I thought this was an important chapter I had to include for all the reasons we know with the discussion now about political Islam, but I often thought that I was not really the expert. And, I've tried to be very careful. Is the Cold War a useful paradigm to explain the Middle East? Probably not, my answer. And this goes back to some of the issues Igor mentioned. Is it useful to talk about the Soviet Union, Poland, the Polish Church, and the Cold War? I ask myself often, is it really useful? It's familiar to those who will read the book. And so I made the concession. I use these terms because people can deal with them and can understand them. But I wonder whether the Cold War is actually a useful paradigm for anything outside of Europe in the second half of the 20th century. I wonder that quite often. So I agree that maybe, these terms are not very useful. But again, they have become stand-ins for something we still try to define. Ideology, yes, communism and the influence on Khomeini. This is, again, something I know very little. I don't speak Persian. I think if I knew Persian, I probably could have written more about this. This shows where my limits are as a synthesizer. Yes, I think anti-communism exists already since the 1930s at least. I write briefly about this in the Arab League chapter. I think there is a regional anti-communism. Of course, then this is the thing what speaking Bolshevik, what Stephen Kotkin wrote about this. You use actually sort of the superpower discourse to make your point, right? I mean, you tie into this discourse in order actually to promote your regional or national agenda. So I completely agree with this. And finally, to Jay, I want to make sure that I say the right thing. Is the nation state, is this a useful unit? This goes back to things I already mentioned. I decided it's the smallest unit, in this book, with the exception of maybe the Palestinians. You sort of have to keep this project, it's a big project, manageable. I heard this in a book workshop, a manuscript workshop. Why don't you just go further down? I would like to do this, and I have an idea for our next project, which takes this into account. It goes back to the issue where the people, but I already deal with 3 levels: the national, the regional, and the global. And it's already 700 pages, and Latin America is not there, and Sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's a point well taken. I will have to think about this for my next project, which sort of starts in the 1970s and goes beyond the Cold War. How do I bring in actually non-national actors or non-governmental actors? Quickly, status, and in the new chapter, the chapter on nuclear weapons, chapter 14, is the one chapter I needed to write so that I can tie the non-European world to the European world, right? It sort of stitches the two halves together, right? And it's not really a European chapter, but it stands at the beginning of the European sections. Status, I needed to have some unifying theme, right? And this is how you try to arrange actually your narrative in a way that it fits into the larger whole. What is status? I mean, status is the perception of power in the eyes of the other side, right? And for all of these countries, it's important to have status because it elevates them above the rest, right? And nuclear weapons are in a way, the pinnacle of status, right? What was so important for India very early in is, for example, the Boeing 707, first the Connie and the Constellation, the Super Constellation, and then the Boeing 707. Because if as a developing country in the 1960s, you could run a modern airline, it would show that you actually made it, right? It's a status symbol in many respects. And what is so interesting, I just read today actually an article about how important social status was actually in the American elections in 2016 and 20. And here the status theme comes back in, right? It's, how you are perceived by your peers, right? This is why, how I see status in very simplistic terms here. So let's talk about, some of the other issues maybe at another occasion, because I know we have 20 minutes left and I'm sure there are questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lorenz. We already have a question, and my dear colleague, Joshua Schiffenson, has been waiting patiently. So Josh.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Lorenz. Lorenz, good to see you again. Victor, always a pleasure. And Igor, we don't have the building anymore, so wonderful to see you. Lorenz, I have not read the book. I have it on order. I guess I have 2 questions, though, having listened to this talk. I guess my first is, while there is a large Cold War historiography, you pointed to Loeffler, Gaddis, obviously, presenting the conflict in very much dichotomous bipolar terms, there's also a very broad, long-standing literature highlighting the agency of local actors, even in the cockpit of politics in Europe. Igor hinted at this when he spoke to the end of the Cold War. But even earlier, we have Mark Trachtenberg writing on the agency of the Germans, the Poles, the French. In the process, Mary Serrati, of course, has written elegantly, as does Greg Domper on the end of the contest, Sarah Snyder highlighting the role of human rights networks. So I guess one macro question I have, having listened to this talk, is whether you see your book as pushing back even on on that Cold War historiography, or drawing from it and kind of extending this work, this local work from that's mainly based upon Europe, more globally. And I guess stemming from that, my second question, and I kept hearing a little bit of oscillation on this, is this a story of several regional localized Cold Wars, or a story at root of how this contest between the Soviet Union and the United States that are really originated in Europe and then to a lesser extent Northeast Asia gradually became globalized and refracted and reflected in a series of regional and local contests? So that's what I got.
All right. Thank you. So it's really what I want to do. You're completely right. I mean, we have this superpower dominated historiography of the global Cold War, and we have regional studies, and individual case studies, or the relationship between a superpower and an individual ally or partner, or whatever you want, puppet satellite, whatever you will fill in. What I found distressing over time is how these historiographies, are basically coexisting, but they don't intermingle. And my plan was really now to draw these regional studies and these national studies into a global interpretation, and integrate them and show them side by side, and see, that there are parallelisms. Very late, for example, by doing this, it was a learning process for me too. I realized, Poland and the two Germanys are not radically different from India and Pakistan and Vietnam in terms of nation state formation after 1945. They face very similar problems. They have a newly reconfigured, they have underwent population exchanges in some cases, right, or migration, and they face often very similar issues. And it's these parallelisms that I came across only by reading various sets of regional studies. I have to admit, not very deeply. You can't be specialist in 12 or 15 different actually regional fields, but you can dabble in many of them, and you see suddenly parallel actually issues coming up. And this also helped me then to think through, what was the Cold War? What was the meaning in the Middle East and in Asia and then in Europe? Of course, the meaning is different, right? Many of the conflicts in Europe are caused by the Cold War. Very few conflicts in the Middle East are caused by the Cold War. So, I mean, there are different levels of penetration by the superpower conflict into these regions. So I'm more interested in how existing, to come to your second question, how existing narratives interact with the Cold War in Asia and the Middle East. To a certain degree, I'm also interested in Europe, in this. I mean, the whole European integration process is not really a Cold War story. It goes back to the 1920s. But in other cases, it was really the Cold War in Europe that imposed actually certain narratives. So in Europe, it goes both ways. Whereas I think in my book in the Middle East and Asia, it's more how regional narratives that exist start to interact with the Cold War. So I'm not a political scientist. That's the nice thing. I can muddle through. I don't have to have a clear concept. I like the the conceptual clarity of political scientists, and I try to learn from them. But I'm still a historian, and I can pick and choose and be eclectic, and that's the nice thing.
Sounds good.
Okay, we don't have any raised hands, or I also don't see any questions in the chat. Does any of the discussants have any question? Because I have a broad question that Perhaps I will broach because we have some time.
I can actually answer one of your questions you had from before, you know, about Asian African internationalism. I mean, the idea at the beginning, Nero's idea was, is this a substitute, right? And then very quickly, you know, he realized it's not going to work. It's just the inherent weakness of these decolonizing states that they could not institutionally build up a rival organization of the United Nations. And plus some of the partners didn't want this rival institution in the first place because they were afraid that it would be Indian dominated. Why does it collapse by the 1960s? I think there are three reasons. It's just becoming too big. It's the Asian African caucus, which is sort of the basis of the Bandung movement, just becomes way too big. And then, you know, is transformed into different units at the United Nations, like the G77, and then, you know, moves into UNCTAD as well by the 1960s. The other thing is also that, you know, apart from decolonization, once decolonization is more or less over by the 1960s, these states don't really share a lot in terms of commonalities. And what really does, let's say, Botswana share with China, or, you know, Saudi Arabia with Indonesia? Well, they were just, you know, they come out of imperialism, colonialism. They are about now to become independent and try to find actually their own ways and their own place. And is the Bandung movement the most useful place for that? Probably not. Finally, it's China that essentially destroys the whole movement by 1965 through its domestic produced radicalism. So in a way, it was you know, doomed to collapse, I think, through many deaths by the 1960s. It's replaced by non-alignment, sort of my argument, and which is much broader, has more an ideological and political goal. And then, you know, to a certain degree by Saudi pan-Islamism, at least in the Middle East, as non-alignment then also wanes over the 70s and early 80s.
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. So the audience, please feel free to ask questions or send it in the chat. Oh, I do see a question from Frank Garretts. He says, I have a question. Is there a reason Africa and Latin America are not part of the book?
Yeah. All right. I know that this question is going to come, and it has already been come before. First of all, I toyed with the idea of adding 3 chapters on Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America and Cuba, because they form also a nice unit. My editor at Cambridge would have killed me. It was already too long, so there was no way that this would have flown. The other thing is also that this is an argument-driven book. I did not want to write just another, you know, Westad book or Bill Keeler book, you know, on international relations in the Cold War, which they sort of have a kind of an encyclopedic feel. I wanted to avoid that. It's an argument-driven book about how smaller powers change the structure of international relations over time. That's the implicit message of this book. I also didn't want to make it too explicit in the introduction. I didn't want to turn off lay readers, but it's the implicit message. And these 3 world regions are the most important because they also happen to be at the periphery of the socialist world. And that's the challenge of the international system in the 20th century. So this doesn't mean that Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa are less important, but for the book, they are not that important for the argument I want to make. In a book with a different argument, they would have had a more central role. And I think if I really work on another book that starts in the 1970s, I will incorporate Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa on a various range of the issues. But for this book, I thought that they don't really matter that much. They are there. The Horn of Africa is there. Cuba is there. When these events intersect with the larger argument. And I have also just one of the things is when you look at non-alignment, particularly Afro-Asianism and Pan-Islamism, Sub-Saharan Africa didn't really play such a big role. Maybe in the non-aligned movement, and it's there when in the discussion about nuclear weapons in the early 1960s, sub-Saharan Africa does actually appear.
Okay, excellent. Perhaps I could ask if my fellow discussants have any burning questions. As I said, I do have one, but it can wait. It can become an email. So Igor and Victor, if you have any questions for Lorenz.
Well, if I may, I would like to share with Lorenz an idea which takes us back to the question that I find so interesting, and that is, if it's in fact true that the Cold War did not end with the fall of the Berlin Wall or the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but if it in fact had ended earlier, as you suggest, and I fully agree, then of course the burning question is, why did it then last another 20 years, right? Why did it take so long for the Berlin Wall to come down, for the Soviet Union to call it quits? What would you say, Lorenz, if I suggested that the two events that really set back the clock in that race to end the Cold War were A, the Vietnam War, which created the impression that the West, not only the United States, but that the West was defeated. Mm. And the second event was the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in 1968. The Soviet tanks in Budapest are often, and I think correctly, presented as having arrived to stop an anti-communist revolution. But I think everyone knew that the Prague Spring was not an anti-communist revolution. If anything, it was in fact an affirmation of socialism. And it was merely a search for a more perfect version of socialism. Let's say socialism minus the Gulag, minus the secret police and arbitrary arrests and torture. So my sense is that the East knew that it was defeated by about 65, 66, 67, when you see all these regional players like Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, looking to establish their own private contacts in the West in order to siphon off the technology and new materials, new management styles, and so on. Would you agree with this interpretation? I think this is my question to you.
All right. Yes, I would. I disagree probably in small details, but that's the great thing of being a historian. We have now something to discuss, right? Now, why did it so long? Because ultimately both superpowers were committed to the Cold War. Gorbachev definitely until 1988. I mean, he's on record saying this. He publishes a book in 1987 in the summer, right? It's basically how to reform the Soviet Union and make it into a viable, actually communist state, right? He's a committed Marxist Leninist until 1988. He's not a Stalinist. I want to make so he's completely committed to this idea. In 1988, he takes stock and he realizes that the Soviet Union basically has bet on losing horses, and he realizes that the Stalinist idea of a geographical defense of the Soviet Union just doesn't make sense anymore. There's an interconnected world out there, which has been become interconnected since the 1960s. I completely agree with that. The same on the American side, this idea to the Cold War. The Vietnam War is a very good example. I teach a seminar on the Vietnam Wars from the communist side, and my students read, of course, also the American literature on this, and they always say, why did the Americans go in 1964? They knew they couldn't win it, right? I mean, it's because you're committed to this Cold War, right? That it's about credibility. You have to maintain credibility, in Vietnam in order to reassure your allies in Japan and West Europe. Of course, the Vietnam War doesn't reassure the allies at all. It undermines actually American credibility. And it definitely has this feedback mechanism on the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union deludes itself that it's actually on the winning side of the Cold War, at least strategically and military in the 1970s, over particular Brezhnev, although Kosygin realizes by the late...
You quote Kosygin as saying, nothing happens without our say, right?
Exactly, right. But Kosygin himself, actually realizes in the late 60s, economically it's not working. Yeah. And Czechoslovakia 1968 is exactly, this issue of we have to shore up a rump socialist camp, but at the cost of unreformability, right, of the socialist system. And, it petrifies after that, with some few exceptions. I think I would probably call Hungary an exception, with what we usually refer to as goulash communism. There were some reforms going on. But the superpowers really, particularly in Europe, petrified the Cold War. But this is not really the case in Asia and the Middle East. That's where the structural change really evolves rapidly in the 1970s. And the superpowers not completely understanding, as Victor said, not understanding in the 1970s, until, the changes are presented, with Sadat going to Jerusalem in 1977. That's what we do now, right? You can come with us or you can leave it. We are going to do this, right? And Carter more or less jumps on the bandwagon, but then Reagan retreating from many of these ideas again, because ultimately he's a Cold Warrior too.
Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. We have reached the end of our time. And I just wanted to thank everybody for this enthralling conversation, both the audience who sent a few questions and also our discussants, my dear colleague Igor, my friend from Schaefer, Victor, and of course our author, Lorenz.